Hey Laowinners, this is Laowinner here with another video, and I remember you guys really liked my video about where I ranked the provinces of China, and I put them in like a tier list, and it offended a lot of people, but that was kind of the fun part, and this video I'm doing today is going to offend a lot of people as well. So my disclaimer first is that if you are from one of these states or provinces that I'm talking about, do not be offended. This is just a very on the surface comparison, and I thought it would be fun to take all the Chinese provinces and find their equivalent American state. So if you're American or Chinese, this video is for you today, or if you just find geography in general interesting. We're going to start off with the boring stuff, and the boring stuff is going to be Shanghai. Shanghai is a city that everybody knows about in China, and it's also like its own province, like administrative region. And I would compare Shanghai very, very easily, very simply to New York. New York metropolitan area is huge sprawl. It's a massive city, glitz and gleam. Shanghai, the same thing. One of the nicest cities in China. New York City, one of the nicest cities in the US. I also threw on Connecticut because the metropolitan area of New York City is also kind of inclusive of parts of Connecticut as well. And just like Shanghai has its own kind of sprawl that goes outside of its, borders as well, but it's still kind of part of Shanghai. The second one, the other boring, easy one to get out of the way, is the capital of China, which is Beijing. Easy to compare it to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., Beijing, two huge juggernaut capitals, huge populations, political centers, important cities. But I also threw on New Jersey in there because Beijing has less of a New York City vibe, more of a dirty-ass like New Jersey vibe, and it smells bad, and there's a lot of pollution there. So definitely could compare it to New Jersey a lot better than I could to New York City. I threw Tianjin in there as well because Tianjin to me is not real. It's just like a boring facade of a city that is next to Beijing and everyone forgets about, so you don't need to worry about that one. Next, we're going to go over to Qinghai, which is a very sparsely populated province full of ethnic Tibetan people, but it's not part of Tibet because it does have like a good chunk of Han Chinese people as well. I'm comparing that to Utah and to Wyoming. Because of the lack of population, Wyoming is the least populated state, and Qinghai is one of the least populated provinces, but it's big, it's wide open, it's beautiful, it's staggering, like the nature is really, really gorgeous. I threw in Utah in there because Utah is famous for having Mormons, and Mormon people are very strict in their morals and what they can consume, and almost have this very traditional vibe to them where they are exclusive of the rest of the country and very inclusive to themselves. A huge chunk of the Hui Muslim people that live in Qinghai are like different than the other Muslim people in China. They're super strict. They don't talk to outsiders. They don't consume anything that's considered haram. Very, very strict. They cover their whole body. And that, to me, is representative of the Mormons. It's exactly how Mormons are, isn't it? Next, we move over to Qinghai's big brother, which is Tibet. Some people consider Tibet its own entity, but I think it's kind of representative of North and South Dakota in that it's very cold, it's very barren, there's not a whole lot of people there, but North and South Dakota are also well known for having a lot of Native Americans. Native Americans being a minority compared to white Americans in the state. Same with Tibetans. Tibetans would be ethnic minorities in their own, area, but also at the same time, also being surrounded by Chinese people, Han Chinese people that had moved to Tibet as well, whether for tourism or business or whatever. So North and South Dakota, I think, is a good comparison for Tibet. Next, we have Texas. Everything is bigger in Texas. Texas is its own entity. It's its own thing. It has its own culture. It has its own vibe. It has its own, kind of cuisine, Tex-Mex and all this kind of stuff. I think Sichuan is the best representation of that. Number one, it's a huge province. Number two, it's full of massive megacities like Chengdu and stuff, which kind of remind me of places like Dallas-Fort Worth, places that are really up and coming that previously people didn't think about. Definitely has its own vibe, has its own dialect. People have their own fashion. It's got its own culture, a lot of hip hop there. Texas is full of a lot of subcultures as well now. It's kind of a hip and up and coming place. Reminds me a lot of Sichuan. Next, we have Heilongjiang, Black Dragon River. This province is all the way up in the north of China, the northernmost province bordering Russia. Kind of reminds me of Maine because both are freezing cold. Both have very distinct people. I think they're very harsh. They live in a harsh climate and have to deal with a lot of tough weather and stuff, so it makes them hardened people, but they can be friendly as well. Now, it also reminds me of Canada, another American state, because it's just the weather, right? It's freezing up there and people have to deal with harsh climates and stuff, but also because of that prevalence of hockey. A lot of people in Heilongjiang play hockey, which is kind of interesting, just like in the state of Canada. Also, another little thing that reminds me of that is that there are pockets of Russian speakers in Heilongjiang, just like there's pockets of French speakers in Maine, which is really interesting. And next we have my favorite province, Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia, it spans like all of northern China, so it's pretty diverse in its landscape and stuff. It's also full of ethnic Mongolians, which have their own nomadic culture. Now, I wanted to compare this to Montana, because Montana is a huge, expansive state, just like the province of Inner Mongolia. A lot of horse riding, a lot of ranching, a lot of outdoor life, hunting, fishing, things like that, just like you would see in Inner Mongolia. But also, it would span even further, because that's only part of Inner Mongolia. The other parts of Inner Mongolia can be barren and freezing, and that's why I threw Minnesota in there. Very freezing, cold state. Parts of Inner Mongolia are actually the coldest parts of China, just like parts of Minnesota are the coldest parts of the US if you exclude Alaska. I threw Wisconsin in there just because I had no idea where to put Wisconsin. I know that they make a ton of cheese and they like cheese, and Inner Mongolia is one of the only places in China where they actually have dairy products, so I threw that in there too. Next, we have China's biggest province, which is Xinjiang. Xinjiang is home to the ethnic Uyghur minority. Actually, in this province would be closer to the majority. They are Muslim in faith, and they are in a very, very expansive, beautiful territory where part of it's forested and mountainous and there's snowy peaks everywhere, and then part of it is barren desert and it's totally hot. Alaska has not deserts, but huge areas that are just covered in permafrost and tundra and snow, which are equally as dangerous and lifeless as parts of Xinjiang, but then also very beautiful areas too, which are mountainous and snowy. And I think Xinjiang, even in the name, if you hear it, the name is new territory, Xinjiang. A lot of people went to Xinjiang just to explore and carve out their own piece of China. You know how populated China can be. So for a lot of Han Chinese people to go to Xinjiang and start a new life was actually a thing. Like, people actually did that. Same with Alaska. I get that same vibe. Also, a lot of people go to Alaska for the oil jobs temporarily. And a lot of people in China go to Xinjiang for oil jobs as well temporarily. So a lot of similarities there to me, and the size as well. Next, we have Ningxia. Ningxia is a small, tiny Muslim province, but it's not the Uyghur Muslims, it's the Hui Muslims. The Hui Muslims look like Chinese people, but they do practice Islam. I love this province. I had a lot of fun there. Amazing food. All the goat dishes were fantastic. I wanted to compare this to New Mexico. New Mexico has great food too, great Mexican food. But it's also very barren. It's also very, wide open expanses and stuff. It's very dry, just like Ningxia is very dry. And then also I threw in Rhode Island because Rhode Island is a small state in America. So it was only natural just to chuck that in there too. Next we have Jilin. Jilin is the most forested province in China. Forests are something very difficult to find in China, at least nominally. Like, when you're traveling around China, you start to miss trees. What happened was during Chairman Mao's time, when they stripped the entire countryside bare, they had to find a way to replant all these trees that they had decimated. So what they did was plant all the same kind of tree, and it looks very organized and unorganic, and it's terrible. Jilin still has really nice forests and stuff, so it was nice to ride through there on our motorcycles. But Jilin to me reminds me of Oregon or Washington, in that there's forests everywhere. It's a very temperate region. It rains quite a bit up there too. It can get quite chilly, but never insanely chilly. So it kind of reminds me of those places. Next, we have the easiest comparison. I think the most poignant comparison, in that Guangdong, the province that I lived in most of the time, all the way in the south of China, home to cities like Guangzhou, on the border with Hong Kong, Shenzhen, definitely is Florida. There is no question about it. Guangdong is China's Florida. I say that because you have cities that are pretty high-end, like Shenzhen in Guangdong. You also have cities that are kind of high-end in Florida, like Miami and stuff. There's a bunch of affluent places there. But when you leave those cities, everything gets super rural, jungly. It's hot and steamy. They eat weird stuff. Let's be honest, people in Florida, a lot of them eat weird stuff. You got alligators and even some people were eating bats, I heard. All kinds of weird traditions and countryside life, just like Cantonese people in rural Guangdong. So definitely, if there was a Florida man comparison in China, it would be from rural Guangdong. Next up, we have Yunnan province. Yunnan province, quite possibly the most beautiful province in China. I had to compare it to Colorado and California. And I wanted to do that because I think Yunnan being the most beautiful province in China, I think California is probably the most beautiful state in my opinion. You have the beautiful coast, but you have massive, huge barren deserts when you go inland, but you still have mountains. You can go skiing and go to the beach in the same day if you wanted to. Very, very diverse, just like Yunnan. Yunnan can be jungly and hot and humid and steamy, and then you can go up into the mountains again, snow peak caps. You can have valleys and meadows. It's absolutely gorgeous there. And to me, that biodiversity, that kind of that different environmental change that you get throughout the province is very similar to California. Also, a lot of drug use. And we know people in Colorado and California love their weed. People in Yunnan smoke a ton of weed. The locals grow it. It grows basically wild, but they harvest it and they smoke it. Mostly older people, ironically. But not only that, not just weed, heroin as well. We found a lot of syringes down there. They have a huge heroin problem. Just like some of the places I've seen in the tent cities and the homeless population here in California. So I also want to throw in Yunnan, we had our car broken into and some druggies stole our stuff. So that kind of reminded me of certain areas around LA that I've seen. Next up, we have Guizhou, which is a southern province, one of the most beautiful provinces in China, full of ethnic minorities and gorgeous mountains. It's also very biodiverse. And because it's one of the more poor provinces in China, in fact, it's usually been the poorest province in China, I could compare it to Mississippi, which is the poorest state in the US. But it's got a lot of river culture surrounding the river, just like Mississippi does. Next, we have Hunan. Hunan is a very polarizing, I almost said state, province. It's very, very pretty. It's a gorgeous province, but at the same time, there are areas that are complete wastelands. So to me, that kind of reminds me a little bit of Nebraska. Nebraska's not ugly, but it's just wide open plains, just like a lot of Hunan is. But then there's also places that are absolutely gorgeous, like you would find in Georgia, perhaps. I also think that Georgians have a certain vibe and flair to them as well. There's that element of Southern hospitality, but there's also that element that you could really piss them off very easily. Just like you would find in Hunan. Very hospitable people, very easy to piss off. Next, we have Fujian, a coastal province. If you meet someone from China in the US that has been here for a long time, particularly people that work in Chinese restaurants, there's a very good chance, I should say Chinese American restaurants, there's a very good chance they're from Fujian. A lot of these people are the ones that left China to come over to the US. That being said, it's a coastal place with its own vibe, a lot of beach culture, very, very different kind of laid-back, chill atmosphere like in cities like Xiamen that I could very much compare to the Carolinas. Also, a very rural vibe, a very southern rural vibe that you would get when you go a little bit inland, just like you would in Fujian. You go inland from North and South Carolina, away from the coast, away from the super affluent areas, and you get a more kind of, homey rural vibe from the nice folk there. Very similar. Next up, we have Anhui. Anhui is this province that not many people talk about. A lot of people leave Anhui to go to Shanghai or neighboring areas for work opportunities. Quite a rural folk. Unless you're talking about like a capital city like Hefei or something like that. But I like to compare it to, based on stereotypes, I'd like to compare it to West Virginia. And I don't think I need to explain why. And I'd also like to compare it to Idaho. And I'll throw a little tidbit in here. My car broke down in Idaho, right over the border from Washington. And I went to the mechanics who actually sorted me out. They were really nice. It was like $50 to fix the radiator leak and put a new hose on it, just because they were bored and they had nothing to do. They also called me because I was wearing earrings, so that's my comparison there. Next up, we have Shandong. Shandong to me is a sophisticated place if you're talking about cities like Qingdao. Gorgeous German concession, beautiful beaches, great seafood, really nice vibe to it, very, very affluent feeling city. And it reminds me a lot of New England, so all the New England states. A very gruff fisherman vibe, but at the same time very affluent, educated, and wealthy. So Shandong always gave me that vibe as well. I was going to throw in Delaware, but Delaware doesn't exist, so forget about it. This one actually offends me. I have to compare Hawaii to Hainan. And I think that's really, really unfair to Hawaii because Hainan sucks. It's like an overpriced wasteland. It's super hot and it's not anywhere near as beautiful as Hawaii. But at the same time, it's always called the Hawaii of China. China's always trying to push tourism there as some sort of like beautiful island paradise. It's not that, trust me. Next up, we have Henan. I feel like people in China hate Henan. It's polluted. It's horrible. It's full of really undeserved stereotypes and at the same time a lot of deserved stereotypes. It is not a well-loved province amongst people in China. So I'm going to compare it to Missouri because Missouri sounds like misery. and that's how I feel when I'm in Henan. Next up, we have Pennsylvania. I grew up right on the border of Pennsylvania in New York, so I'm quite familiar with the state. I think it's quite similar to Liaoning. A lot of it's very boring, but at the same time, there's also some really cool cities. You got Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and stuff. A little bit rough vibe, just like the cities in Liaoning. Dalian, to me, when people talk about Dalian, they talk about this like, it's got some Russian influence, some Japanese influence, but it's a pretty rough place, to be honest. It doesn't have this like really amazing feel that everyone keeps talking about. It's kind of rough around the edges, but it kind of gives it some charm too. Next up, we have the province of Jiangxi. Jiangxi is interesting. It doesn't have this vibe that Guangdong has. Guangdong people are Cantonese, so they have kind of a separate identity to the rest of China. They're not minorities, but they just have their own culture and vibe to it. And Jiangxi has that same kind of environment. It's jungly, it's hot, it's sweaty down there, but they're very much nationalistic. They don't have their own like special, we are from Jiangxi. We are different. We have our different language and stuff. Jiangxi is very much like a pretty pro-China, pro-nationalist province. And I get that kind of vibe when I go to a place like Arkansas or Kentucky. They're very much salt-of-the-earth people that are very, pro-America. So I kind of get that vibe as well. Very rural as well. Next up, we have Guangxi. The cousin to Guangdong. Dong means east and Xi means west, so the two Guangs, one is east and one is west. Guangxi is definitely the more wild of the two. Much less developed, very hot and jungly. Guangxi is full of like a lot of the stereotypes you heard about like cannibalism and stuff back during the starvation periods of China. Guangxi is a very much a rule-breaking province. If you go to somewhere like Yangshuo or anywhere near the border of Vietnam, there's arms smuggling, there's a lot of drug trade and that kind of stuff. And also there's a lot of, outdoor food culture and a lot of minority culture. I get a huge Louisiana party vibe from Guangxi. Guangxi and Louisiana, both very wild, crazy places. They eat wild, crazy foods and are known for their wild, crazy gatherings. Everyone got mad at my tier list when I ranked all the Chinese provinces because I forgot about Hebei. So I tried to find Hebei again, but it was actually too polluted and I couldn't find it on the map. Next up, we have Gansu, a windswept, barren region. Kind of reminds me of Nevada and Arizona, but also Oklahoma, because it's kind of biodiverse, because of it goes up in elevation, it goes up to the north of China and all the way down to the center of China. Very much a wide open expanse of nothingness, just like these states. Next up, we have Hubei. I'm going to compare Hubei to Illinois and Michigan. Reason being, I feel like if you're in America, the highest chance that you're gonna die or get murdered would be if you're in Detroit or in Chicago. So it's kind of like if you're in Wuhan, like in Hubei, that would be your highest chance of dying in China as well. Next up, we have Xinjiang and Jiangsu. I threw them together because they're like basically the same province. These are coastal, wealthy regions, home to a lot of big companies, very smart, affluent Chinese people. And I get a Maryland vibe. Maryland also, outside of Baltimore and stuff, a very wealthy state, also coastal, full of, a lot of entrepreneurs and very enterprising individuals. I get the same vibe as Zhejiang and Jiangsu. Next up, we have Shanxi. Now, Shanxi, outside of its capital, Xi'an, you might have heard of the Terracotta Warriors. Outside of that, it's kind of a polluted wasteland, very Rust Belt-ish. So I'm going to throw Ohio as a comparison. Ohio being a very good place to be if you're in the surrounding areas of like Columbus or even the rural areas. But outside of that, you have places like Cincinnati and Cleveland and stuff, which are definitely Rust Belt. Like think about Toledo, places like that, very Rust Belt-esque areas. Very Shanxi vibe. Same with his brother, Shanxi. Shanxi is known for its pretty good food, but also Rust Belt. You get places like Kansas and Iowa and Indiana that people just forget about. Let's be honest, a lot of people just forget that these states even exist. I feel like Shanxi gets the same reputation because at least his brother has like Xi'an and a lot of tourism and stuff. Last one I'll throw in there is Chongqing. Chongqing broke away from Sichuan province. It's now one of the biggest megacities in China. I get kind of a Nashville vibe. Tennessee can be super rural, but at the same time can also be like a pretty hip place if you're in downtown Nashville and places like that. So I feel like Tennessee and Chongqing would be a good matchup. A lot of art, a lot of music. They're kind of like brother and sister in a way. I think that just about covers it. I apologize if any of you were offended. It's just a joke. There were some nuggets of truth within these comparisons though, and I hope this kind of paints a more human and interesting picture of China if you've never been there before. You can at least make some nominal comparisons in your mind. I want to say thank you to everyone supporting me on patreon.com/Laowinner. I answer your questions there every single day, and I appreciate the support for my work, as a lot of my videos get demonetized. Hopefully this one didn't, but you never know. Don't forget that every single Monday, you can watch ADV China, a motorcycle talk show on 2 wheels, where me and my friend Winston travel around the world on motorcycles and talk about stuff. Every single Wednesday, you can watch me, Laowinner. And every single Friday, you can watch my friend, Serpent ZA, Winston, just in time for a beer. And then every other Thursday, we have our podcast, which is where we talk more at length about China-related issues. And we have a new channel, which is called Worthless Whips. Worthless Whips is our car channel. And we buy a cheap car, we try to fix it up, we review it, and then we try to flip it. And it's our new project. We're really proud of it. I recommend you guys go check it out. Even if you don't like cars or you don't care about cars, I think you'll find some entertainment value in that show as well. And that's every single Tuesday. Thank you so much, Laowinners, and I'll catch you on the next one.